Great, you've successfully installed the Raspberry Pi operating system, configured the Wi-Fi, and you know the IP address of the Raspberry Pi in the network. What we can do now is to use SSH to take control over the Raspberry Pi and really get access to it. So first of all, I'm going to open a file explorer here and go to my main partition here, go to users, to select your username, okay? And here you may see a .ssh folder here. If you don't see it, well, you have nothing to do and you can just skip the next 20 seconds or so. If you have an SSH folder, you're going to go inside and you may have a known hosts file. What you can do is, if you don't know SSH or stuff, you can just simply remove that file for now. It may prevent some errors when you try to connect to your Raspberry Pi. Okay, and now what you can do is to open a terminal, okay? So Windows key and then CMD or command, and click on that, and this will open a terminal on Windows. So if you are using Linux, I guess you know how to use a terminal, and if you're using Mac, you can also open a new terminal, okay? And if you're using Windows 10, okay, Windows 10 with a quite recently updated version, you can simply connect to the Raspberry Pi with SSH on the terminal. So you can easily check if you have SSH available for you on Windows 10. Okay, simply you can type SSH on the terminal and press enter. Okay, here I have a message usage SSH. So if you have that, it means you have SSH and you don't need to do anything else. If you don't have that, and if instead you have a message like SSH command not found, then it means you won't be able to use SSH in the Windows terminal. So in that case, in that very specific case on Windows, you would need to install another software to use SSH, and you can, for example, use PuTTY. So you can go on putty.org and you can simply download it, install the software, and then start it. So PuTTY is an SSH client. You can use it the same way we are going to use this command line here. This will just make you use a GUI tool, so you will have to fill up the IP address, the username, and the password, as we are going to do here. So coming back to the terminal, what you can do to get access to your Raspberry Pi is to type SSH and then space, and then you need to provide the username. So what is the username for Raspberry Pi, for your Raspberry Pi? Well, the default username that is already here when you flash the OS into the card is named simply Pi, okay? So there is no way for you to discover that. It's simply the default one that I'm giving it to you here. You can also find it on the Raspberry Pi website. So we are going to be connected as the user named Pi. Then you can put @ and the IP address that you found here with your IP scanner software. So for me, it will be 192.168.43.56. So of course that will be different for you, okay? So just use the IP address you found there, and then you can simply press enter, okay? For the very first connection, you will have that message. Are you sure you want to continue connecting? Because actually the host here, your machine doesn't know, has not been connected to your Raspberry Pi before, so you can just press yes, okay? And now it's asking you for the password, okay? So we have the user Pi and we need to give the password. So what is the password? Well, the password is simply Raspberry, okay, like that. No uppercase, no space, no nothing, just Raspberry like that. So you can go ahead and type Raspberry. You will not see anything, okay? As you can see when I typed, you will not see anything written on the screen. And then you press enter. And if it works, if you've provided the correct password, then you're in. You can see here you have the Pi user, and then the hostname is Raspberry Pi, and you are connected to the Raspberry Pi for the first time. Great! Let's now install and configure VNC. VNC will simply allow you to use the Raspberry Pi desktop from your own computer. This is great, so you don't need to only use the terminal with command lines, and you also don't need to have a monitor plugged to your Raspberry Pi. And even if you have a monitor, you will see that it's sometimes more convenient to work without it. So the reason why we set up SSH just before is simply because we need to access the Raspberry Pi through SSH so we can actually set up VNC. So that's what we are going to do here. So SSH, then you put the username, which is pi here, at, and the IP address. So of course, this will be different for you. Okay, press enter, and the password is still Raspberry. Okay, don't worry about the warning message here about password. We are just going to change the password later. So here, to enable VNC and make it work correctly, there are a few different steps that we need to do in the order, so please follow along. First, you are going to type, so here you are in a terminal inside the Raspberry Pi, you are going to type sudo space raspi-config, okay? And if you see that, for example, if I press tab here, I can have the auto-completion to make sure it is the right command. So sudo will make you run the command as an administrator on the machine, which is required here, and raspi-config is just so you can get access to the configuration. So you press enter, and it will bring you to that menu here, so you can navigate using the arrows, okay, from your keyboard. It's very simple, and then just press enter to choose whatever you want. And the first thing we are going to do is go to interface options. Okay, press enter, and then go to VNC, press enter again. And would you like the VNC server to be enabled? You're gonna select yes, press enter, and you can see the VNC server is enabled. So I'm going to use the right arrow, okay, to go to select and then finish, and then press enter on finish. And I am going to reboot the Raspberry Pi with the command sudo reboot. So you do sudo reboot, enter, and you can see now, so the Raspberry Pi is rebooting, and we are back to where we were before. So here I'm back on Windows, okay? I lost the connection to the Raspberry Pi, okay, because of course it's rebooting. So now you have to wait, okay, a few seconds until the Raspberry Pi has boot again and is connected to the Wi-Fi network, okay? I'm going to use the same command as before and wait a bit, and then press enter, and you can see when you have the password, it means that the Raspberry Pi has correctly rebooted. So you just put the password Raspberry once more, and you are back to SSH, okay, on the Raspberry Pi with the Pi user. And now you are going to go back to raspi-config, okay, with sudo raspi-config. And so here the VNC server is enabled, but that's not going to just work like that. So you need to go here, we are in 1, so I'm going to press enter, okay, and go to boot autologging, and I'm going to choose, so by default that may be one of those, okay, console, but you're gonna choose desktop or desktop autologging, okay. So it means that it's gonna boot on the desktop, and if you use autologging, it's gonna boot on the desktop, and it's not gonna ask you for the password to boot. Okay, so I'm going to use that because it's just simpler. So I press enter. Okay, and then what I can do is I can just go to finish again. Would you like to reboot now? Okay, they ask you that because you have changed an option that needs a reboot. So do you like to reboot now? Yes, you press yes, and it's going to reboot again. Okay, so I'm going to make the steps one by one, okay, and reboot every time so that you can see each step, okay, one by one. So now you have to wait a bit until the Raspberry Pi has reboot. So I put the password Raspberry again. Okay, and I'm going back to raspi-config, and the last step, we are going to go on display options, okay, and resolution. Okay, and you're gonna choose a different screen resolution than the default one, okay, because for some reasons If you have the default resolution, the VNC server may not work, so you have to choose a different resolution here. And which one to choose? Well, basically choose the one that corresponds to your current screen here. So on my laptop here, I have a full HD resolution on the screen, so I'm going to choose the full HD resolution. Okay, so you press enter on the resolution you want. Okay, the resolution is set, blah, blah, blah. Okay, and then go back to finish. Would you like to reboot now? And yes, and you reboot one more time. Okay, so those are the 3 steps we need to do so we can enable VNC and make it work. So now we have set up VNC on the Raspberry Pi. So this is the server side. What we need to do now is to get the client. So here I'm using Windows. I need to get a client so I can actually connect to the Raspberry Pi and get access to the desktop. And to do that, we are going to actually install the real VNC viewer. Okay, so you can go to that URL here, realvnc.com. You can simply also type VNC viewer, real VNC, and it's basically the first link. And as you can see, this is multi-platform, so you can choose whatever OS you're using right now, Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. As you can see, there is a Raspberry Pi here, but don't mix things up, okay? If you choose this, this is the client to connect to the Raspberry Pi. So if you choose this, basically it means that you are controlling a Raspberry Pi from another Raspberry Pi, okay? Here we are controlling the Raspberry Pi from Windows here because my laptop is running Windows at the moment. So I'm going to choose the Windows client and simply download it. Okay, save it, and when it is done, you can, okay, I already downloaded it before, so you can just run it and go through the installation setup. And once it is installed, you simply have to launch the application, okay, and you will get that view here. So what are we going to do now? First, make sure that your Raspberry Pi has been reboot, so it is powered on, it is running, and also make sure that here I'm going back to my network configuration. You should have the correct configuration because you could just previously connect to SSH, but make sure you always have your computer and your Raspberry Pi on the same network, otherwise you won't be able to connect to the Raspberry Pi from your laptop. So now I'm going to go here to File and New Connection, or you can just press Ctrl N if you want. And here I'm going to put the IP address of the Raspberry Pi. Okay, so really make sure that you note that somewhere so you don't forget it. And I'm giving a name. This is just a name so we can recognize the connection here. Just Raspberry Pi. You can put whatever name you want here, okay? And let's click on OK. And now I'm going to double click on that. Okay, you may have a warning like that, and don't worry about that. Let's click on continue. If you don't have the warning, it's fine too. And now you have to give the username and password. So the username here is Pi and the password is Raspberry. Okay, just like we did for SSH, okay? You can choose to remember the password or not. I'm not going to do that now because we are going to change the password later. Okay, you can now have access to your Raspberry Pi desktop without any external monitor